the Richard and Judy Book Club, exclusive to WHSmith. For more great reads, why not head to our website and download more of the shows? Take the book and Richard and Judy with you.
Judy, I've got to tell you that reading Mrs Hemingway by Naomi has really made me think about, love and marriage.
I hope you're not thinking of taking tips from Ernest Hemingway.
Well, he certainly had plenty of practice, but I suppose with 4 marriages under his belt, it's fair to say that he never really got the hang of it.
Some say practice makes perfect.
I think I've practiced enough, and you are perfect.
Oh, Richard, bit over the top there. Come on, let's get going with the next podcast.
Everything now is done à trois. Breakfast, then swimming, lunch, then bridge, dinner, then drinks in the evening. There are always 3 breakfast trays, 3 wet bathing suits, and 3 sets of cards left folded on the table when the game, abruptly and without explanation, ends. Hadley and Ernest are accompanied wherever they go by a third. This woman slips between them as easily as a blade. This is Fife. This is her husband's lover. I think writing is kind of quite a lawless place sometimes. There's no rhyme or reason or method or system to doing it. This book was very different from the first book. It required so much research. So I took 6 months to write each wife, to research each wife, and then a year to edit and put them all together so it would seem like a novel rather than kind of 4 short stories. So there's not a formula for me apart from mornings are best when I'm a little tired still, so the censorship voice in my head can't quite wake up, and I'm kind of writing ahead of that and with a nice cup of coffee. Hadley and Ernest sleep together in the big white room of the villa, and Fife sleeps downstairs in a room meant for one. The house is quiet and tense until one of their friends arrives with soap and provisions, idling by the fence posts, wondering whether it might be best to leave the 3 undisturbed. They lounge around the house, Hadley, Ernest, and Fife, and though they know they are all miserable, no one is willing to sound the first retreat. Not wife, not husband, not mistress. People have asked whether I've ever felt like Hemingway's 5th mistress to complete the quartet. They were all real people, and it did take a long time to do all that research about their personalities, about, where they came from, their biographical information. So it's meant I spent a long time feeling like I was in bed with these people, mistress, wife, and husband. They do come home with you. There's a sense that, they kind of haunt you for a long time. And I think it's taken about a year after the book was published to kind of get these characters out of my system, because they did become incredibly real to me. And Hemingway himself, I'm a great fan of his work, and I have been since I was a schoolgirl. And I think I'm still fascinated and so intrigued by his pathology and what made him tick and why he acted like this with all these women. And eventually, thinking about why he committed suicide, I'm very, very intrigued by his enormous swings in mood and talent as well. They have been in the villa like this for weeks, like dancers in relentless motion, trying to exhaust each other into falling. The morning is already warm, and the light has turned the white cotton sheets near blue. Ernest is sleeping. His hair is still parted as it was during the day, and there is a warm, fleshy smell to his skin that Hadley would tease him about, were she in the mood. Around his eyes is a sunburst of wrinkles on the brown skin. She can imagine him squinting out over the top of the boat, looking for the best place to drop anchor and fish. She lies looking up at the ceiling. The beams have been eaten away, and she can track the worm's progress through the wood. Lampshades sway as if there is a great weight to them, though all they are is paper and doweling. Someone else's perfume bottles glint on the dressing table, like presses at the shutters. It will be hot again today. Hadley really wants nothing more than to be in cold, old Paris in their apartment with the smells of pigeon, roasting on the coal fire and the pissoir off the landing. She wants to be back in the narrow kitchen and the bathroom where damp spores the walls. She wants to have their usual lunch of boiled eggs at a table so small their knees knock together. It was at this table that Hadley had her suspicions of the affair confirmed. I think Ernest and Fife are very fond of each other, Fife's sister had said, but that's all she had needed to say. I just think that writing changes you at the end of 3 years because you're so tired. You're so kind of exhausted by the whole process of editing and redrafting. I think it makes you, as you're writing, it sensitizes you to the world around you, and suddenly you notice things that perhaps you wouldn't have noticed before, and everything becomes... I was swimming yesterday and I saw this kind of dummy figurine which a lifeguard would use, and I thought, oh, that's brilliant, because that's just like one of my characters, kind of implacable and hard-faced and kind of that mask, and I thought, oh, that's brilliant, I can use that. So I think you do become quite sensitive about the world around you and how it's going to feed into your story, even if it is historical.
I love this book. I absolutely adored it. I didn't want to put it down. It's a lovely story of 4 women, 4 very different, very individual women, all of whom had the fortune or the misfortune, depending on how you look at it, to marry Ernest Hemingway. Each of them speaks for themselves in their own particular section of the book. Each of them is completely different, and put together, it's an amazing portrait of Ernest, this amazing literary talent, this titan of literature, who was nevertheless a complete mess and awful to his wives.
What I thought was really convincing about it, and when we talked about it with the author, this was explained, was how authentic it came across. I mean, it's a novel, you know, it's a sort of made-up story about real people, and you kind of wonder how much license she took, talking about the wives and their feelings and the conversations they had with Hemingway. But she did about 2 years of solid research in the archive. And the archive, fortunately, about Hemingway, because of course he's a 20th century writer, is voluminous. And she went to America and she went to the British Museum, and she has seen the letters and the diaries of these women, and she's worked very skillfully to tell their stories in a way they might well have told them themselves. So it's very accurate. Therefore, that's why it's so believable. And I mean, as a man, I was astonished at how vulnerable Hemingway himself was. I've always seen Hemingway as this sort of marlin catching, shark wrestling, bear shooting, sharp shooting Yahoo guy.
And a war hero.
And a war hero and a war correspondent and a fantastic novelist to boot. But basically, 100% male. And yet, he was pretty vulnerable and had his weak side, and he needed women to shore him up. And that comes over very clearly in the book.
Yeah, he did. And he was, of course, fantastically attractive. I mean, that's what... in his early days, we all now, I think, remember him as that kind of gnarled old man with his white beard and his white hair, and overweight and kind of looking very drunken and all the rest of it, which of course he was by the end. But when he was younger, when these women fell for him, he was gorgeous. Well, he was not only incredibly talented, he was fantastically glamorous and beautiful looking as well.
There's that fabulous Woody Allen film, isn't there, made about 4 years ago, Midnight in Paris, do you remember?
Oh, yeah.
And Hemingway, with Hadley, his first wife, appears in that film.
That's right.
And I forget who played Hemingway there, but whoever it was, he was Mr. Good Looking. I mean, he was just incredibly handsome, vibrant, and confident, confident in his writing, even though at that point, when he married his first wife, and we read all this in the book, he hadn't actually written his first novel yet.
No.
Although, as we know, he wrote it in 6 weeks when he got going, and it was an extraordinary time.
But I also loved the way she kind of, it's not just a sort of anxious cry from the heart from these women. It really encapsulates the time, the glamour of it, the way the women dressed, the wonderful lives they led in Antibes, the south of France, in Key West, in Cuba,
Havana,
and the incredible sort of glamour and exoticism of those days, and all that comes out, as well as the women's passion, and as well as their, as well as how abandoned they felt by Ernest. It's a brilliant book. I loved every minute of it.
Whatever else, they had a great time.
Naomi Wood's Mrs Hemingway on the Richard and Judy Book Club podcast, exclusive to WHSmith.
And I have to say, without fear of contradiction, this is probably my favourite.
Ooh, no.
Oh, I'm sorry, I can't help it. I'm allowed to have a favourite from time to time. I did love it. I thought it was an absolute jewel of a book. I was really sad when I put it down, but basically what it is, and then you can sort of take it on and explain it. It's Ernest Hemingway's 4 wives. He had 4 wives during the course of his life. And you have written a quarter of a book each, basically, from the voice of each wife as it happened. It's beautifully done. It's terribly upsetting, and at the same time it's really glamorous. So it really is, because he had a very glamorous life in many, many ways. So tell us about, first of all, start us off with the first one, who I think most of us have heard of, Hadley.
Yes, so it's Hadley Richardson, who was a kind of self-avowed spinster, I think, until she met Ernest Hemingway in 1921 in Chicago. And she had a very poor self-image, and she thought of herself, she's kind of this very dumpy, not very attractive 29-year-old. So by then she was, on the shelf, exactly, in those times. And then she met this lieutenant who had just come back from the war in Italy, and he fell in love with her. They fell in love with each other over 9 months and sent each other these incredible letters.
He was beautiful, wasn't he?
He was gorgeous. Yeah. I mean, very, very dashing, and had a very clear sense of his own talent and his own wit and charm, and that was something which kind of characterised him over 4 decades.
Was he writing then at that point?
He was writing, but very occasional pieces, bits of journalism, juvenilia that wasn't really going anywhere. But Hadley had a great investment in his talent and saw that he would be successful, and she said, I'll back you up in everything you do. So they were married 9 months later and moved to Paris pretty quickly, where they set themselves up in this, as you said, hugely glamorous life of, 1920s jazz era Paris, with the Fitzgeralds, with the Picassos.
Well, and so many Americans. I mean, the Americans kind of defined Paris and the south of France at that time,
didn't they?
Yeah. And brought all of that kind of carnivalesque Paris, Rococo kind of huge show business and kind of amazing party atmosphere down to the south, down to Antibes and the Riviera, and really founded the Riviera.
They invented the Riviera in summer, didn't they?
Yeah,
Until then it was a winter resort.
Exactly.
The British went there.
Nobody would ever go in the summer because it was too hot. And the Murphys, Sarah and Gerald Murphy, invented sunbathing. She said, the pearls have got to see a bit of sunshine to keep them alive.
So are we to say then that Hadley, and if not all of the wives, helped to give Hemingway this extraordinary self-confidence, or was he already sort of there by the time she met him in Chicago, or was her backing and her belief in him, was that the beginning of his super confidence?
I think you're right. I think Hadley, and certainly Fyfe, Pauline Fyfe, the second wife, they bolstered him in a way that it just wouldn't have existed without them. Every moment, every loss of self-confidence, every moment of introspection and kind of wretchedness when he thought about, am I a good enough writer, next to Ezra Pound, next to Fitzgerald? They were always backing him up and saying, we've got you and we're putting our money on you.
Well, that's what I found really interesting in the book and revealing, because, I mean, obviously we all know that he ended up by taking his own life, probably. But I always saw him as I say, a super confident, almost immovable ego. But what comes across is how needy he was. He was actually very needy, wasn't he?
Yeah, and I think that was the point of writing the book from the wives' point of view, because, one, it hadn't been done before about showing him in a private space. And no matter what a kind of he-man or kind of huge ego you could be, and he was a celebrity, he was the world's first kind of literary celebrity, there was a private sphere and there was a domestic sphere where he kind of shed all of that and had to be real. And he was, I think, my interpretation is that he was very needy, and you can see that from the letters that he writes the wives. I mean, they're bursting with kind of pillow talk and kind of baby talk and sentiment.
And why did they allow him to go off with other women? I mean, was it Hadley who let...
Well, she kind of knew, didn't she, that Fyfe was on the scene?
She did, and she did
invited her on holiday with them, knowing they'd get to bed.
And Pauline Fyfe turned a blind eye. Martha Gellhorn wouldn't have any of it, because she was the one probably with the most sense of self and the most.
So she was in her own right, an extremely famous American war journalist, and wouldn't have any of this. She didn't want. She loved Hemingway, but she didn't want. She was going to be nobody's little wife.
I mean, I never really understood why she married him in the first place.
No, me neither.
I think the affair that they had in Civil War Spain, so kind of jumping ahead to the end of the 30s, was this incredibly tempestuous affair, but it also kept them alive in a very basic sense, that they were being shot at by German and Spanish soldiers.
In the Civil War.
Yeah, in the Civil War. 36 to 39, and it was just this terrible sense that they were in imminent danger of losing their lives, and they kind of kept each other alive. And then as soon as they married, you know, they said the thing we couldn't survive, we survived all these trench lines and all this war, and the thing we couldn't survive was domestic life.
No,
what do you think, though, gave Hemingway this voracious sexual appetite? I mean, he craved sexual variety, didn't he? I mean, he just got bored with women physically, apart from anything else. He wanted new stuff.
Yeah, I mean, I think that the question almost is, because I think many people are like that, men and women. The question is, why didn't he just have girlfriends?
Yeah.
Why marry every woman he ever had sex with?
But you kind of sort of know, don't you? I kind of know. I mean, I you know, just reading your book and obviously reading his books too, you kind of know what kind of guy he was in there. He had to have everything, didn't he?
Exactly, so that's why he had to have a wife.
Yeah, he had to have a wife.
And it couldn't be a girlfriend, because it had to be everything had to be kind of bedded down in this institution of marriage. So he had to be a husband to someone, and he couldn't just kind of have these affairs. And I think, you know, if you read his memoir, Movable Feast, there's this sense that whenever Hadley arrives on the scene, she's this kind of salve, she's this kind of amazing positive force when the writing's not going well. So I think there was a sexual appetite for women, but there was also a real longing inside of him for something that they gave to him, some nourishment, some spiritual companionship.
And the last wife, Mary, she was kind of different again, wasn't she? She was much more, they all nurtured him, but she was more of a nurse, because actually he needed more nursing at that stage. He was very much broken down by the amount he drank, apart from anything else, wasn't he?
Yeah, by the 50s, I mean, he was in a really, really terrible state. I think you look at him in the 1920s and the 1930s, he's this kind of golden boy, and he looks fantastic, as we said. And then by the 50s, he looks like an old man. You see pictures of Hemingway, and he's completely white, and he's only 51, 52. He gets involved in this terrible plane crash in 1954, which leaves him with injuries for the rest of his life. He was already such a big drinker, and could possibly have been suffering from bipolar disorder. That's a kind of posthumous diagnosis.
I mean, your description of the early days on tea, I was reading that in this summer, and we were in the south of France, so it's kind of making me kind of feel very nostalgic.
Especially now that it's freezing.
Yeah, we actually went to one of Scott Fitzgerald's villas there, didn't we? Which is now a hotel.
Yeah, the Bellevue.
The Bellevue. Yeah, we went in there, and I was reading this book, and I was thinking, it just makes it sound so enticing. You know, the fact that he was kind of writing away, and then endless cocktails and gin and the sun, and then a swim, and it was just all perfect.
And a superabundance of talent as well. I mean, his first novel he wrote in 6 weeks. I mean, and then he revised it over a year, but there was this kind of sense of crazy, super concentrated talent that everybody could drink and have a marvellous time, and for things to be carnival. But people were also producing these kind of masterworks.
He was super strong, wasn't he? He was super strong. Okay, killer question, he said. Could you have married him?
Not anymore.
No, he's dead. What do you mean?
Cast yourself as you are now, back in, say, 1935, and he's on the market, and you've met him.
I think 10 years ago, I would have been putty in his hands.
Yeah.
And I think I've met a Hemingway myself, which is where some of the book comes from.
Ooh.
And I've learnt from that scorching experience and never want it to happen again. No,
okay.
I would say no now. I'd say thank you very much.
No, but let me say that it is a lovely book, and I love the way, I must just say that you've written from each woman's perspective, and you're not bitchy or horrible about any of them, and yet you've given them all a voice. And they all sound very rounded and lovely, and you actually end of it think, well, actually, in the end, Hemingway, although I understand his attraction, didn't deserve any of them. And that actually is a nice way to come away from that book, I think, to feel. It's lovely to hear from the women behind this vast, shining talent, and to discover that they were shining too. They glittered, all of them, in their own indefinable way.
And what was your research for all this?
Extensive, long, and very heavy.
Oh, right, okay.
It took about three years, diaries, love letters, telegraphs,
right.
mostly in the JFK collection in Boston, a lot in the British Library. There's a huge amount of correspondence, but there's also videos of Martha Gellhorn, which is fantastic.
Yep.
There's audio tapes of Hadley talking to an interviewer saying, you know, after the divorce, I felt like just like $1 million. She said she was thrilled to be
love the
free
description of the way he went to the Ritz and liberated the wine.
Yeah, I know. I think that's got to be apocryphal.
Well, probably. But what I did love about all of it, and what I do love about him and that whole period, and F. Scott Fitzgerald and everything, it just makes the whole place sound. We all know that they died horrible deaths and committed suicide and but God, it doesn't half sound like a great way to live, does it?
I mean, they had a great time.
They had a great time. And that's what comes over from that book. It really, really does. I loved it.
It's an absolute delight. And if you get it specifically from our partners in the book club, WHSmith, you will find at the back of the book exclusive content, including an extended Q&A between Judy and I. So there we are. Mrs Hemingway, Naomi Wood. It's a treat. Thank you.
Well, I can't believe we've completed yet another series. It's been another great collection to add to our book club library.
When I first picked up a copy of my book, it was an absolutely wonderful experience because it just sort of was very beautiful and it was very emotional. And I suppose it feels strange because it was once this sprawling manuscript and then this idea in my mind that I didn't ever know would come to fruition. And there it was, this gorgeous object, and I was very happy. It was a very good day.
Every time I hold the first book, first of all, it comes in a big box, and you open the box and the smell of the books just hits you, and then you see the cover, and you've seen it on the computer. Do you know what I mean? So you know what it looks like, but until you're feeling it in your furry little paw, it's the best feeling in the world. It really, really is.
So when I held the book for the first time, I want to say that I delved straight into it and kind of, you know, in a torrent of delight and pleasure, but the feelings are very extreme moods of kind of pleasure and absolute anxiety.
Don't forget, you can download each and every book via Kobo for your e-reader, tablet or smartphone via the Kobo app. Well, I see the to-read pile of books is stacking up again, ready for our attention. You ready to get stuck in?
I'll get the supplies in.
And I'll get our onesies, and we can get cracking those covers.
You haven't missed any of our shows yet, you just haven't downloaded them. Check out whsmith.co.uk/Richard and Judy